So this episode begins with the Fire Nation being invaded by somebody from the Earth Nation. They're running down the streets with a scroll in their hand and they are being pursued by some Fire Nation soldiers. The Earth Nation soldier sees another one of his comrades waiting for him, but because he is being pursued by the Fire Nation, he sends the scroll to his comrade and blocks the path and decides to take on the Fire Nation soldiers by himself. The Earth Nation soldier is taken to the king of the Fire Nation. He tells the king that his people already have the Fire Nation's plans. The king doesn't seem bothered, as they want the other nations to move their forces in the wrong direction. This is so that the Fire Nation can aim much higher. Water, earth, fire, air. The four nations lived in harmony for millennia. The Avatar is introduced and it is told that they are the sole person that are able to use all of the elements. The Fire Nation is trying to eliminate any Avatar as they are the only person that can stand in their way of their plans for world domination. The Southern Air Temple is home to the Air Nation. We are introduced to Aang, who is overlooking the village from one of the spires of the buildings. Aang flies down and is speaking to one of the masters. That's when he finds out that some of the air nomads from the other temples are coming to visit them. There was a council meeting amongst the airbenders and they are discussing Aang. The master that was speaking to Aang earlier is saying that he is still young and that he is still learning. He also mentions that it's too soon for Aang to start learning some of the other bending methods from the other nations. Despite his master's protest, he still tells Aang that he is the next Avatar and that he will soon be leaving to go and learn some other nations' bending techniques. Aang is upset when he finds out that he is the next Avatar and that he would need to leave his home. Unable to sleep, he takes a ride on Appa and gets caught out in a storm. It is at this time that the Fire Nation decides to attack the Air Nation when they are least suspecting. The Air Nation tried their hardest to fight back, but they are overwhelmed by the Fire Nation, and it isn't long before the whole town is destroyed. The Fire Nation makes sure that they kill every man, woman and child in the hopes that one of them is the Avatar. Aang tries to make his way back home, but somehow ends up in the water, and that's when his Avatar powers come into play. It looks like him and Appa are in a spear, which is then lost at sea. There is a girl standing before a body of water and she's waving her hands. It looks like she's trying to do some water bending, at which point doesn't seem to be going too well. Having failed at water bending, she heads back to her village, Wolf Cove. There's a boy giving orders to a group of other children, letting them know what their route is going to be going forward in regards to managing security of the village. He calls out to the girl and we find out that her name is Katara. He asks Katara what she was doing and asks if she was water bending again, and tells her that she needs to be careful because they don't want the Fire Nation to know what it is she's doing. The current pulls the boat and they end up going in a direction that they weren't expecting, and they end up being pulled towards a cliff face made of ice before Katara and Sokka ends up on an ice bank. The bank they landed on has a big ball of ice with an object inside that they're not too sure about. Shortly after, we see the Fire Nation ships in the ocean surrounded by ice, and it looks like they may be in the same area. Katara tries to pull the boat closer, and at this time, unbeknownst to her, it seems to activate the Avatar along with the statues on the Fire Nation's boat. Aang emerges from the ice and his arrow is lit up, and shortly after he passes out. Katara tries to grab Aang and to take him with her back to the village, but Sokka is not for it and wants to leave him there. In the village, Gran is looking at Aang and she tells everybody that she believes that Aang is the last airbender. Prince Zuko is talking to his uncle and he's trying to say that he believes the Avatar is back and that he wants to go to the Water Nation to find the Avatar. His uncle thinks that he's being too eager, but Prince Zuko tells him that his father had told him to find the Avatar and that it is his destiny. Aang wakes up and finds himself in unfamiliar surroundings. He goes outside and sees some of the kids playing. Sokka is speaking to Aang and he suddenly asks him where is Appa. He ends up flying into the air, shouting out, and then uses his whistle in order to call Appa to him. When he lands, he asks if anybody has seen his sky bison and even describe what he looks like. He repeats it a few times until Appa appears from nowhere and lands behind him. Aang is telling the clan about what happened to him with the storm, and from his description, Gran has determined that something isn't right here. She starts to tell a story about how the Avatar was supposed to learn all of the bending techniques and that how when the world needed him the most that he had disappeared. She also mentions how the Air Nations haven't been seen in generations and how the Southern Nation was the first to fall. She finishes up by saying that the last time anybody saw an airbender, or let alone anyone from the Air Nation, it was 100 years ago, and she makes it clear to Aang that he is the last airbender. Zuko is talking to some of his subordinates on the bridge, and they are a little upset about going on all these search missions based on Prince Zuko's whims. He lets them know that they have a mission, and unless they complete it, they cannot go home and see their families. Katara is telling Aang about what happened to her village the last time the Air Nation had attacked. The boat lands at the shore, and Prince Zuko is practicing his skills on the bridge. Prince Zuko's uncle tries to tell him that he was given a task which his father had thought might be impossible, and that his return home may be unexpected, which Prince Zuko doesn't believe. Katara takes Aang to the cave where she practices her waterbending and shows him her skills. She lets him know that she is the last waterbender in their village. Aang gives her a little bit of advice about how to feel the energy. She takes his advice, and all of a sudden she is able to use her skills to move the water. At this time, the Fire Nation pulls up to the bank. Katara wonders why the Fire Nation has visited their village, and Gran says that they are there because they are looking for Aang. Because not only is he the last airbender, he is in fact the Avatar. Sokka feels vindicated as he mentioned that he knew that Aang was hiding something. Prince Zuko makes his demands and says that he doesn't need anything from the Water Nation apart from the person that doesn't belong there, meaning Aang. It appears that Sokka is getting ready to give up Aang until Katara stops him and says that they are there to help people, and he eventually softens up and decides to help instead of giving him up. Sokka goes to meet Prince Zuko and demands that they leave. He challenges him to a one-on-one combat, which Prince Zuko agrees to. It's not long before Prince Zuko has the upper hand until Aang steps in to stop Prince Zuko from hurting Sokka. Aang takes on some of the Fire Nation troops, and it's not long before Prince Zuko realizes that Aang is an airbender. Prince Zuko commands his soldiers to burn the place to the ground, but Aang says that he will go with him. Before he leaves, he tells Sokka that he's never had someone try to protect him before, and it seems like he is quite grateful. He then turns back to leave and go with the Fire Nation. Katara tells her brother that they need to go and help Aang. He ignores her at first, but then goes up to one of the other soldiers in their village and tells them what they need to do security-wise for the village. On the Fire Nation's boat, Aang is locked up in one of the cells. Iroh is on the other side of the cell, and he is speaking to Aang. Aang asks why the Fire Nation started the war, and Iroh mentions that it could have been because of their drive to conquer through peace and unity. Aang doesn't believe this and says peace comes from respecting life and not killing and destroying. Shortly after, Iroh leaves, but before he does, he tells Aang that he will have some jasmine tea sent to him. Aang uses the opportunity to steal the keys off the guard by using his airbending skills. Sokka wanted to use a boat to try and catch up to the Fire Nation, but Katara had a different idea. She decided that they're going to use Appa in order to rescue Aang. Free from his cell, Aang is trying to find a way off the boat, but ends up going into a room which happens to be Prince Zuko's. He looks around and finds Prince Zuko's diary on the previous avatars, and then he takes the book. While standing by the door listening out for guards, he sees his stick. Aang makes it to the bridge and uses some of the items there for cover, but he is quickly seen by Prince Zuko, who calls out for him to stop. Aang jumps off the side and uses the stick to fly away. Prince Zuko commands his troops to open fire on Aang. Prince Zuko also fires at Aang and manages to hit him, which resulted in Aang falling. Aang manages to grab his stick just before Sokka grabs him. They fly away on Appa, and Prince Zuko tries to fire another fire beam at them, but it stops when Katara uses her waterbending to get in the way of the fire blast. Aang thanks them for coming to save him, and they discuss what their next step is. As they realize they can't go back to the water village, they then decide to go back to the Air Nation where Aang grew up. Aang looks around and sees what has become of his home, and also finds the skeleton of his friend, one of the masters. Aang's tattoos light up and he is lifted into the sky, and he causes more destruction to what little is left of the buildings. Katara tries to call out to him to get him to come back to himself, but while this is happening, Aang is having flashbacks of a conversation that he had with his friend. Aang eventually comes back, and he is hugged by Katara as he cries. It is at this time that Aang has decided that he needs to complete his training and do what it was that his people wanted him to do. Also at this time, Prince Zuko is in his room and he draws a picture of Aang, which he then sticks on his wall. Aang says that he is the Avatar and that this is just the beginning before the episode ends. Thank you for tuning in to the recap for The Last Airbender, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and please stay tuned for the next recap.